Hey, Michelle, is there more than one phone number listed on that screen? A different call-in number?
Hey, Katie.
Oh,
It's Marty.
oh, hi.
How are you? I said
Good.
I've been sending some email with Brian Hensel.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will. I want to talk to you later about how we can see if we can do that as an e-bid.
Oh, yeah, I think that's much easier.
It's way easier. All right, thanks.
Okay, bye.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine, Neil.
Awesome.
How about in the conference room?
We're struggling a bit with that phone.
Okay, give you a minute.
Yeah.
We're ready to begin, guys.
Looks like the conference room is still the issue, so we're gonna wait.
Sounds good.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, Kim.
I've had 4 webinars or Zoom meetings. It's just like,
Yeah, I think I spent 9 hours yesterday on video conference calls. It was a little.
I was started out this morning with legislation, watching a hearing, and then my computer blew, and the power box went out. And so
Makes it more complicated.
yeah.
Hey, Michelle, what is the number on that phone there in the conference room? Is that 6791? Okay. Let's see if Michelle, if you can unmute maybe on your screen. Is that working now? Somebody talk? I know.
Katie, looks like 6791 is in the attendees. I wonder if you can move them into the panelists.
Yeah, I allowed him to talk, but is that somebody different? Michelle, is there a red button? Is that phone red or is it green? Oh boy.
So somebody who's a host of the meeting, see if you can move that attendee phone number into the panelist. That'll let us control the.
Give it a try now, please.
Okay, the conference room is not working.
Hey, can you hear us now?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes, is that you, Michelle?
Yes! Oh, yay!
You have
Yay!
sign language.
Whew. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, sounds like we're on, right? Can you hear us in the conference room?
Everybody here okay?
Yeah.
Woo!
I'll go grab Brian.
Thank you for getting us through these technology issues. We appreciate it. So I can't. This is Neil. Speaking. I can't quite see who's in the conference room. Can anyone tell us who's there?
I'm Susan from the city attorney's office.
Thanks, Susan. It's good to hear you.
This is Pat, board member, Pat McHugh.
Hey, thanks, Pat. Thanks for attending in person today.
Yeah. Brett Gilman, Missoula City Cemetery.
Thank you for taking your time and coming over.
Brian's on his way. Michelle just went to get him.
Is Paul on?
You know, I haven't heard from Paul. What I've emailed him though, I just get an out of office reply. I'm not sure if he's going to be here or not. What's up?
I saw his name up there and then it disappeared.
Oh,
So I don't know if he got disconnected or.
Looks like he's just muted.
Paul, can you hear us?
Oh.
And can anyone see if we have any community participants who have called in today?
We do not.
Okay, thank you. So I apologize. I couldn't be in the conference room there with you guys. Can
you hear me now?
To watch the kids for me today. Paul, was that you?
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you now.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, thanks for calling in. It's good to hear your voice. Like I said, I apologize. I wasn't able to come down to the conference room and meet with everyone there. I'm at home with kids today. But thankfully, due to this amazing technology that we have, hopefully we can get through this today without any problems. As we discussed last month, the kind of the plan for today is to go through the Sloan write-up point by point, get the board's feedback on that, and then moving forward, what we'd like to do is put together a priority list of what work we think needs to be done and when. And with that, I'm going to ask Jeremy if he doesn't mind stepping in and starting. He's going to kind of lead this meeting for us today, and we can go forward.
You bet. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you.
We want to focus on the strategic plan today and hopefully get through all the comments. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if that's okay. So I want to first just give you a little timeline on how I see this going. This is my suggestion, so feel free to modify this if you don't think this works. But I think what we're starting to run up against is our next budget season, and we really want to have the strategic plan approved and put away before we roll into that budget. So we do have to look ahead a little bit. Hoping to get the strategic plan approved by the board here in January. If we need to have another meeting, we'll do that. And then we'll take it to council after the board makes their decision. Then we've got a number of recommendations in the strategic plan and other recommendations for ordinance updates that Susan was working on with Ron, and those updates we could bring to the board in February for your review, and have those worked out by March and start that process. And then I think the next step with the strategic plan is really to look at setting priorities. The plan lays out a whole bunch of recommendations, but it doesn't really tell us what to do first. And so I think we should have a discussion about what we want to tackle and what we think is realistic to put into our fiscal year 22 budget. And that process really starts up in March, April. So we'll want to get those requests pretty dialed in by the May, June timeframe. We usually make our budget presentations in June or July. So we want to have all that dialed in, ready to go. So that's kind of the timeline that I would look at. Any thoughts or questions on that before I go on?
Jeremy, this is Pat. When's the deadline to adopt budgets?
The city budget, our fiscal year starts July 1st, but we typically don't adopt the budget until September. And that's largely driven by when we get the taxable values from the State Department of Revenue. So we don't see those until August. So we certainly want to have everything presented to council prior to that, but they won't make final decisions until late August or September.
Thank you.
I have a question. This is Paul. Just in terms of that kind of budget review or budgeting process, the plan suggests a sale of property of cemetery lands to fund projects. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, it seems to me, that the land sales, there's a lot of information that needs to be taken into account before there's a sale of land, in my opinion. And I don't think that would happen before the budget, the 22 budget request.
No, I don't think that's not possible.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna flip over to the strategic plan. This is the report that the Sloan Group put together for us, and I think the best way to do this is just kind of go point by point through their report and look at their recommendations and talk about each one to see where the board is at on those. And ultimately, what I want to do here is see if there's anything that we want to go back to the consultant with and ask for changes to the final report before we bring it to council. Or if you're okay with those recommendations, we leave them as is. So I'm not going to go through all the introduction background stuff. I assume you've had a chance to look at that, and
so Paul had done that. I guess I would like us to at least acknowledge the points that Paul brought up in his email to us, and on page 1, where they do talk about short-term and medium-term, that they don't base, Paul had indicated his concern on it lacks long-term or perpetual.
Can you expand on that a little bit, Kim or Paul?
So, yeah. This is Paul again. I understand that the purpose of this report, as they say, is to provide a strategic plan for short and medium term, but ultimately that impacts the perpetual care of the city cemetery, and that's not mentioned. And it just seems kind of odd to think that we'd be doing a strategic plan with where the ultimate goal is perpetual care, and just looking at it as a short and midterm concept. I would argue that there needs to be a statement in there that, while it is short and midterm strategies, ultimately it's benefiting the perpetual care of the cemetery.
I certainly think that makes sense. And I guess help me out here. I'm going to take notes. If there's something that the other board members maybe don't agree with that we're adding to this, please speak up. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that we have consensus on adding that comment. Anything else on the introduction section?
I think that was it, Jeremy.
Yeah. So section 2 is market analysis. This is mostly just data. I don't think they have recommendations in this section. They're ready to go on to section 3 then?
Mhm.
But I think, again, this is just past data trends that we've been seeing. So don't have anything further on that.
I don't have anything on that portion of it.
Okay. So section 4 start into the land analysis, and this is really going back to sort of the history of how the cemetery was developed and the land that was purchased for cemetery use. And this section is important in that the decision facing the cemetery with what to do with the current undeveloped land is obviously one of the big recommendations in this plan. What I've heard previously from the board is that there's general agreement with the analysis that the consultant did around what our current capacity is and what our future needs look like. We still have within the existing developed portion of the cemetery, which is what we're looking at here, both that orange area and even within the older historic parts of the cemetery, there is still significant capacity for additional sites. So the consultant estimated that within this area, we still have roughly 200 years of capacity.
Jeremy, one thing to maybe to note that that I reread this several times, and although in that land area we have whatever it was 100 years of capacity, but if we sell off the area that for instance that we're using as the bullpen now, that then needs to be moved into that area. That we would so it's not quite the 100 years that I understood from their from their write-up. And it might be 95 years, but I just wanted to make that distinction that if we're going to do a land sale of land that we're currently using, then that needs to be incorporated into what's left.
Yeah, that's an important point. Anything that's happening currently that's outside of what we're calling the existing developed cemetery, could affect that future capacity. So their recommendation, let me move to what the recommendation is. So they're saying we have 200 years of inventory. And that when they looked at the surplus land, what they're recommending is that we retain some portion of that bullpen area and this, I think it's about 5 acres of land immediately to the south. So that would stay in cemetery use, and that gives us a lot of flexibility to work with those other needs. And then all of the land to the east of that would be the surplus land.
So on this, one of the things that I was questioning is they were talking about the shop being moved, the office being relocated to the south in the purple area. And right now, so say that was done, right now, that area is used when we have like the Stories and Stone for parking. And if we sold off all this extra land, we would have nowhere for that. If we're looking at bringing in the bird watchers and the tree watchers and all of those types of possible activities to the cemetery, it seems like there needs to be an established parking area that would suffice for a number of vehicles. I mean, even large funerals, I've been there when it's like you can't get around anywhere because of the number of vehicles that are parked in the street lanes and stuff. And they didn't address that anywhere in the plan.
That's a great comment. Thanks. There's always an opportunity cost with parking. Parking uses up a lot of land, and if it's only being used once or twice a year, that's a lot of land to dedicate to stuff like that. But thinking through how do you have a big event and where do people park? It's pretty important.
So Paul, on page 11, you had that comment.
Yes. Yeah. Well, they make several kind of suggestions here, but on page 11, but they don't end up on page 13 under the list of recommendations, which just seemed kind of, ultimately that's where if you were in the future, if we were looking for recommendations, they should be listed in the recommendations part. Just a suggestion on my part, but rather than having to go through the text and reread the text to find the recommendations. And one of the recommendations they make there is that there should be a fence on the east side of the grounds around the bullpen, but that doesn't show up in their later recommendations. And for that matter, just in terms of the land sale, doesn't show up there in the. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but I would think, doesn't it seem logical that in the recommendations you would list ultimately all your recommendations for the area?
Yes.
Yeah, I think the way this is presented, we definitely want those recommendations to all be in this little summary section so that it's clear that's what's being recommended.
And Jeremy, I don't know how, I'm not a land person in terms of purchase or sale, but it seems to me if the city were going to sell a piece of land, there'd be an analysis that would go along with that prior to the sale, value analysis of some sort. Shouldn't that be one of their recommendations, that we should do some value analyses? Or is that just standard operating procedure that would come from the city?
Well, I think the city has a standard process for how we divest of surplus lands that, includes the need to establish a fair market value and whatever other city goals might be attached to that.
Okay, so that would defer to the city in that process.
These recommendations don't really speak to the excess land, though, and how that would be done.
Yeah.
Let's find where that is talked about.
Hey, Brett, since we're on the land topic, I just want to make sure that we're discussing your thoughts as well on this.
So one of the things that I thought we should look at further in thinking about a new building or a new office is just taking a little harder look at that existing building and what its functional use is. Can it be renovated and modified to make it work better, or are we really looking at a brand new building? And the scope of this study didn't get into that. I think that's something that we should do before we decide to move that office.
I would absolutely agree with that.
Jeremy, is this a good time to talk about the board's ask as far as what could be put on that so-called excess land that we're talking about divesting? We had specifically talked about not wanting industrial put there, which would detract from the cemetery. Would certainly prefer like a residential community.
So yeah, that's probably a good comment to get in there. Jumping back to the master plan. So the master plan, which looks a little bit different if we divest of that land, does contemplate all this yellow would be residential. So that is consistent with the master plan, but I think being more clear that if additional land that's shown in green on the master plan does get developed, that should also be residential.
So Paul had another comment on that page 12.
Yeah. Just a question on that map that you just showed, Jeremy, from the MRA study. Was looking at it, it's a different perspective of the cemetery in terms of the relationships of adjacent properties and streets. And there's kind of no reference point within it to kind of understand why it was thrown in here and how this and the impacts of it. But for instance, as you just pointed out, the yellow is representing the presumably residential areas. I didn't know that until you just said that, which is great information to know, but it also suggests that Hunton isn't there. Is that a correct assumption? And that there are a lot of new roads that are surrounding the cemetery?
Yeah, this is where Hunton would be today. So yeah, it suggests that property redevelops into something different.
Yeah, just question, if it was appropriate to throw this into the master plan, into our strategic plan, I should say, or if it just causes a little bit more confusion in terms of, I think the purpose is to suggest, hey, there's this other plan we should be looking at as we consider developing the cemetery. I'm on board with that. But to throw this drawing in here unrelated to that, to all the context of how the master plan was developed that MRA developed, it seems odd. Just another question, by putting this in here and the board approving this strategic plan, does it in essence suggest that the board is approving the MRA North Reserves Scott Street master plan? I mean, in kind of a vague way, it seems to imply that.
Well, that plan's already been approved, so it already had input from the cemetery board, and then ultimately was approved by city council. So that is the master plan for the area. It's a guiding document. It doesn't cast anything in stone, but it certainly is something that, as a policy, needs to be looked at before you take on projects or make other approvals.
I guess I would prefer that the consultant look at it in terms of, they don't include this map, and they include it in the concept that they're trying to portray and reference the master plan, the MRA master plan, rather than include this map in our strategic plan.
I agree.
I mean, it would be the North Reserve Street master plan should, by all accounts, be a part of this document by reference. So reiterating that to any future reader would be appropriate, it seems to me. As would many of the other plans that the city has adopted in terms of, conservation, recycling. Yeah.
How do they do there? Did I capture your comment?
Sure. Thank you.
So, one of the things that's happening with this whole area is there are a lot of moving pieces. So things are changing since the time when this master plan was adopted. And I think that we may need to go back and update the master plan, or just recognize that it's a broad guiding document. It doesn't necessarily mean that exactly everything shown on this map in terms of where streets go and which properties are residential, which are industrial. Those sorts of things can have some flexibility, but you look at this as the guide, and it really should set the direction that you're following.
As long as we're in this area of the document, another comment on page 12 that was made is, and towards the last paragraph, it says, you also could look at partnering with other city agencies to share equipment and or maintain or a maintenance facility. And when I came on the board, there was a lot of discussion about that. And the board went through that, and maybe there's different opinions on the board now, but at that time that was put to bed as far as I'm concerned. And I don't see that as a short-term or long-term goal.
How do others on the board feel about that? You know, one of my challenges in managing the public works department is that, you know, cemetery funding is part of the general fund and is, you know, always subject to the whims of council, and showing efficiency and the ability to share equipment and facilities is something that I think is appealing to council when they're struggling with budget. I think that, you know, part of the reason of doing this plan is we really want to make sure that the cemetery is on good footing to continue to receive the funding that it needs. But that also means that we really do provide good fiscal responsibility of how we use that money.
Jeremy, a question on that. Does, I've been in the shop, but you know, if it was shared with another group, road department, whomever, you know, is the buildings that we have sufficient, or would that be part of the, we need to move the shop, we need to move the office to make things more effective? I would just hate to see everything squeezed in there and it be taken over by another department when, you know, it's tough for what we have right now.
Right. I think it would be more in the context of if you're going to build something new,
Oh,
how can it be shared? How could it be, you know, combined into a facility that works for more than just the cemetery? And the other piece of that is equipment. So, you know, if the cemetery is buying lawnmowers and Parks Department is also buying lawnmowers, and then both of those pieces of equipment sit around half the time and aren't being used. I'm just making this up. That's as just an example. It may not, that's probably not true, but you know, it's that duplication of equipment that both departments add a cost and they're not being utilized 100% of the time. So those opportunities to share the things that we're looking at across our entire department and with other departments in the city.
Seems like it would be a really big challenge for if you were sharing equipment with other departments, that who has priority, and you know, would that take away from the ability of the upkeep that has been shown throughout the years at the cemetery, if all of a sudden we have to wait because some other department is using whatever equipment is we need?
Yeah, it is certainly challenging to do that, and it's more complicated for everybody that's managing that stuff.
Jeremy, if I could just jump in on that real quick, that goes on a small scale in public works for sure. And the way that I typically manage it, people from different departments will call and ask wanting to borrow a specific piece of equipment. And the way I manage it is if I'm not using it or schedule it on Fridays, for example, and the crew's off, anyone's welcome to borrow our equipment, including the cemetery. And we've done that on a small scale with success. But I don't know how you could do it on maybe a larger scale where it's a day-to-day use or even a week-to-week. But sporadically as needed, we've done it for years and it works extremely well.
Just in keeping with time, I kind of feel like this is maybe a larger conversation. I would say the board is certainly not opposed to it if it works for everyone. And correct me if I'm wrong, anyone who's certainly absolutely against it, please chime in. But there's a lot of considerations there, and I think we would need, you know, like Brett or someone on the ground in the cemetery to tell us, okay, does this rolling stock get used, you know, 5 hours a day or 15 hours a day? You know, and the board is also kind of used to the fact that Ron was really good about maintenance and care and utilizing equipment well beyond its lifespan. And in that, we felt like we were really helping the city by not, you know, buying a $40,000 lawnmower every 2 years, but every 10 years. So, I mean, I feel like maybe there's a larger operational conversation around this. Should we maybe put that in the parking lot and for another conversation, just so we can move through this document today?
Yeah, I think that's a good
I'm-
suggestion, Neil.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I agree with you.
What I would point out again with this plan is this plan gives us a lot of things to look at. It doesn't make the decision to actually do things. So the decision to buy equipment together or share a facility would still have to be really worked out and vetted by the board before we launch into that. So this just says look at it. I think that's a lot of the recommendations is, there are things that we should consider when we're looking at taking on something new, like new equipment.
With that comment in mind, Neil, one of the recommendations here that is in this screen is to partner with the Parks Department. I wonder if we could just change that from Parks Department to other city departments and not be as specific. Leave that to that future discussion.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, to be efficient, we probably should be partnering with several other city departments.
Okay, so I just wanted to capture that previous comment about how would the land be divested? What's the process for that? And then how will the land be used? Make sure we get both of those comments into that list of recommendations.
And then, Jeremy, just one other thing right there is a comment on, as you look at that recommendation, it says, look at siting a new building with land and potentially partnering with parks. If we could just change Parks Department to other city departments rather than being specific at this point.
Sorry for my bad typing. Okay, we're partnering with other city departments, not just parks. Okay.
Paul, on your one comment on page 13 with the include the landscape recommendation and discussion of fencing so it's not lost in the future read of this report. Are you talking about like where it says begin planning a site landscape buffer or? Yeah,
yep. Yeah, again, they make some recommendations there and they're just not, they don't bring them forward in the summary of recommendations. They're in the text.
So I lost you a little bit. Does that go in this list here?
Yes. Yeah, they make a recommendation earlier in that the text above about some buffers and around they kind of use the pump house and bullpen interchangeably, but the idea is that there'd be some landscaping around the utilitarian spaces on the cemetery, and then it doesn't land in the recommendations.
Okay.
Same with the pump house. They make a recommendation earlier to maintain the pump house, and that's not listed here. But I would say that's a general comment throughout the document.
So the next section of this is talking about the proceeds of the land sale and setting aside funds from the development of the surplus property to help cemetery fund capital projects. And these are the projects that they're suggesting to be funded through that.
So, and are you looking to have a kind of a more comprehensive list of recommendations? Would that be where the board has develops that list, or would that be like a separate recommendation from the board outside of this document?
I think it's a separate document that puts more detail on these ideas, because we don't have costs for any of these things.
Okay.
And we also don't really know what that surplus property is worth. So we need to do a little work on, what's that sale going to look like? How much potential revenue from the property could come back to the cemetery?
Okay.
But Jeremy, the report lists like 4 items. I think what Paul is suggesting is that, who knows what those items might be. Is it make sense to, as Paul suggested, list more items in no particular order, or obviously there's more work that needs to be done in terms of determining the value and prioritizing the projects, and sort of these lists of projects that Paul included are certainly others that could be included. I just wouldn't want someone to presume these are the only 4, or these are the 4. I mean, there's certainly lots of projects, and as time goes by, who knows what might become the more pressing project. That was only my comment on that one.
Does it make sense to try to get a list of all these projects that are suggested and put costs to them, so that we can sort of look at what the long-term capital needs are from a cost perspective?
Yeah, possibly, and maybe in the strategic planning document, maybe it just references, rather than listing any projects among others, and they're just to make it more generic or general than to be specific as to these. And I don't have a problem with the projects that are listed in the strategic plan at all. It's just if you list one to the exclusion of others, then is it presumed that those are the priority projects, that type of thing? It might just be some language to change in the document.
I think that what they're really suggesting here is that there's something that comes back to the cemetery capital fund, that then the board can decide how to use that. But understanding what our total needs are is going to be important in determining how much goes into that capital fund.
Yeah, I agree. I think the word they use is ideally in front of those projects that are listed, and that's what makes me think, the strategic planning document is saying ideally these are the projects that would be completed, and it might be entirely unrealistic, or there may be enough resources to do other projects where we don't have to limit ourselves to these. That's probably my main point.
Okay. How's that look? Capture that okay?
can't see it from where I'm sitting. I'm sure you did.
I don't know if I can make this thing bigger, but,
Would you like to change places with me so you can see?
I'll send this out when I'm done here. I recognize that you guys can't review this as I'm typing, so I'll get it out.
Sounds good.
Okay, we ready to move on to the next section?
Yeah.
Okay, section 5 is infrastructure. I'm going to make a number of different recommendations in here. It's okay, I'm going to skip to the bottom and then we can move back up. Here's the summary of recommendations. Replacing the frontage fence on Cemetery Road with an ornamental fence or a softer edge, or removing it completely. Replacing the entrance with some ornamental fencing, gates, and pillars. Removing the western fence to provide a more substantial privacy fence. So that's the edge along there. I can't remember the name of the company, but it's the manufacturing.
Roseburg.
Is it Roseburg, or is it there's somebody else in there too that does good products? And then also screening that north fence line, which has a lot of industrial activity going on just the other side of the fence. So I thought those were all good recommendations. We certainly can talk more about what kind of fence and whether removing a fence or keeping some kind of an edge is important.
Out of all of their,
like
this was the one thing that I disagreed with as far as removing the fencing in front or creating a soft, short edge. It just seems that that street has enough accidents on it where cars are driving into our fence as it is. There's been enough theft going on and problems that removing a fence just opens it up. It's I personally don't like that first suggestion.
I think on several occasions the board has discussed that we probably wouldn't support removal of any fences. Certainly beautifying existing fences are a good idea, more welcoming to the public. But due to the safety and security concerns of where we're located, we're pretty much in agreement as far as needing at least some sort of fencing around the property line. Kim, Paul, Pat, does that sound correct to you?
Yeah, I agree with that.
I like the idea of softening it, especially on that border. I think that suggestion is good. And I guess I'd be curious if the type of fence was an ornamental fence that wasn't necessarily one that kept people out. If I'd be interested in learning what other cemeteries have experienced when they've had more of a lower level fence. I like the suggestion of improving it. It's not very attractive at all on that south side. And I'm probably lukewarm on the removing of it. I'm not. I would like to hear more from the cemetery experts about that, whether that's a big safety or security risk. I imagine it could be, given the location of the cemetery, but so I'm in general agreement, I think, but probably not as concerned about that that fence being some monster fence or something.
what the consultant told us was that their experience is that the fencing is a perception of a problem and not a real problem, that they tend to find that when fencing is removed, they don't see a big increase in the amount of vandalism or problems. This cemetery is kind of isolated, so it doesn't have, the things we like with parks, eyes on the park, so which tends to decrease the amount of bad activity we have. One of their key recommendations, I think, is to make the cemetery inviting, that it invites the public into the cemetery. And I think you do that by removing fences or creating more opportunities to enter the cemetery at different places. And so if we keep a fence, maybe there's more gates, maybe there's more places where people can come in and out. Or maybe you just make it look nice and direct people to the main entrance.
And I would agree, Jeremy. I'm not opposed to that idea of fencing can do that. It can be inviting. It doesn't have to be imposing, and it can be ornamental, and it can be soft. But to remove it completely, I'm not sure I'm on board with the complete removal. And maybe it's just me. I don't refer to the cemetery street. I always called it Cemetery Road. But maybe it is a street now.
No, I think it's Cemetery Road. We'll fix that.
I have a comment, Jeremy. In the paragraph there where they talks about how to replace a frontage road and the cost of what that would be, they don't specify what that fence would look like or what it is. It just says this is what it's going to cost.
Is that this paragraph right above?
Yeah.
Cost to replace the front fence and entrance gate be roughly $100,000. Yeah. Yeah, I think they're just assuming that it's a nice decorative fence as opposed to just a chain link fence.
I'd imagine that varies greatly as far as what you consider decorative. Is it going to be stone or is it iron or,
Yeah, it would.
We'll just steal the fencing that Fort Missoula put up. Just a quick time check here. It is 12:56.
Just a comment on that cost that was made, kind of following up on that. It may be in the best interest not to include those figures in here, only because it leads a reader to presume that somebody has looked at a design there and actually made an estimate. And that number is so contingent upon what that fence could be. If that's black chain link versus a iron fence, those are significantly different costs. I'm hesitant to, now that it's called to my attention, I'd be hesitant to include specific costs on something like that in the document. It implies that we're aware of some design and some research that was done, and we're not.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe we just want to keep that for our own information and not put that in the report until we get a better handle on what kind of fence and how much.
Oh, I liked your comment in regards to the east side fence not being discussed or any recommendations, that they didn't include that.
They talk about an east side fence earlier on in the document towards the residential area, but then when the fencing discussion comes up, they never talk about it.
Okay. Any other comments on the screening idea of the western fence or the north property line?
I was wondering, on that west side, given that those properties, the property owners over there, and the fence is protecting their property as much as the fence is protecting the cemetery's property, did they engage with those property owners to have a conversation about, like, hey, is it possible we could share a fence design, or is there something that I don't know. I know that our property line over there is very tight between the drive lane and the graves as well. And just another question would be like, is there an opportunity there in a whole land exchange idea that we could obtain a little bit more property on that side of the grounds to then put up a fence and landscaping similar to other parts of the cemetery? I don't know if they had those conversations or not.
We don't really have any land on that end that we could exchange, though, do we? We'd have to acquire it.
Yeah, there you go. Buy it. In the MRA master plan, were those in a long-term look? That is, are those kind of uses intended to remain in that area?
They are. So that edge, the cemetery kind of creates the edge to the industrial uses that, at least in the plan, they foresaw that those would continue to be there.
Sure.
The cemetery neighbors don't complain very much. Okay. Ready to go on?
It's 1 o'clock. Is everyone okay staying on the meeting for a little bit longer?
Yes.
Sure.
We'd scheduled for 2 hours if everybody has time for that. And I'm also happy to entertain a break if anybody needs that.
Does anyone need a break?
I could use about a 5-10 break.
Sure.
I'd appreciate that. I've been on meetings nonstop this morning, so.
Yeah, let's take 10 minutes. Is that okay with everyone?
Okay, it's 1 o'clock now. We'll reconvene at 1:10.
Perfect.
Does everybody know where the restrooms are in this building? No. So if you go straight down the hallway, past the entrance where you came in, it's just on the left.
Okay, thank you.
Miss Susan, you want to step outside for a little bit? Sure. Definitely.
Were you able to locate that?
Huh?
Were you able to locate that file you were talking about earlier this morning?
No.
Doesn't look that old for
Yeah. Did you guys look all over for it?
Yeah, I couldn't find it anywhere.
There's getting public. Yeah, we gotta take a look at that language before we go on.
Give everyone another minute maybe to join back on here.
I'm back. I'm just eating my lunch, so I'm going to keep video off.
I understand, Kim. Sounds good.
And I'm back too.
Welcome, Paul. Can you let us know when everyone in the conference room is good to go again?
Yeah. I think we're just missing Brian.
It's 1:12. Jeremy, are you back yet?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay. Shall we continue on then?
Yep.
I'm interrupting your lunch too.
I just had a quick banana. I'm set. So our next section here is on facilities, and I was just skipping down here the recommendations. They are recommending repainting the maintenance garages in a neutral color. It draws less attention to them. Using landscaping to obscure the two primary maintenance buildings where possible. And then I think the big one is designing and building a new long-term facility that consolidates the restrooms, meeting area, space for administration, sales, and records. This is to replace the chapel and replace the existing restrooms and deal with the office space. So those are the three recommendations. What comments do you have on those?
So, I mean, I'm not opposed to any of that. As the cemetery continues to expand into new areas, I question in my mind the idea of consolidating bathrooms to one point. In my mind, I would just do the opposite of that. I would try and offer more restrooms throughout the facility, which I realize is a big expense, but the population that utilizes our space needs access, is kind of what's going on in my mind. The other thing I guess that goes through my mind is if we're looking at relocating the bullpen, does it make sense to then relocate the shop buildings as well into that same area? They could be obscured together. Obviously, that's a bigger expense than talking about just landscaping, but
what they talked about earlier was that the maintenance building was in pretty good shape. And recommending doing anything with the maintenance shop and garages. So, you know, if those remain, then it's more a question of screening them.
sure. I guess I didn't quite understand their recommendation on getting rid of the chapel.
Okay, so that's this section here. So they're saying it's difficult to heat. It's too small for a lot of events, and it use is infrequent. Does it also have ADA issues?
I don't believe so. No, I think that's one of our few spaces that don't have an ADA issue. Yeah, I guess in my mind, if we made improvements like to the heating system, then would it be more usable for gatherings, and would that increase its use?
Wouldn't that just sort of fall that this is the recommendation, but maybe, you know, that's all it is? That,
Yeah, you know, it does say to keep the chapel until we had another facility, and so I think that process of figuring out how big of a meeting room do we need?
Sure.
If this is too small, what do we need? I don't have a good sense for that. I have not been in very many meetings in that building, and so, you know, it's an okay space for certainly a board meeting, it seems like. But if we're trying to have other types of events like family gatherings or a service or something like that, maybe it's too small.
Yeah, that makes sense. Then I guess in my mind, the recommendation should be to do a needs evaluation of space as opposed to
And you could carry, sorry, this is Paul. I think you could carry that idea onto both the cemetery office as well, in terms of the recommendations or the ideas that they throw out there. I think they say at the top of page 18, the building is in poor condition. In our opinion, the structure is aging and will need to be replaced, which that's a pretty strong statement. So just, yeah, I think there needs to be a little bit more analysis there before make that kind of a statement.
And that's talking about the office building, right?
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
If anything, I'd say, I'm sorry. I was going to say the building that is, you know, in terms of what the public's perception of the cemetery is the restroom. And that the restroom building, while it is incredibly utilitarian, is also, you know, of a pretty low standard, even less than what Parks you'd see in what Parks is doing currently. If anything, I'd say that building needs to be replaced. But again, just my opinion.
The restrooms would be a higher priority than the office or the chapel. Is that accurate?
I think that's fair.
At least the chapel. I'm not sure about the office. 'Cause that's just such tight space for those that are working in it for storage of files and
I think the other piece that wasn't really thought through in this particular document was the apartment that's in the office space as well.
Does anyone know, is that apartment?
If they do get rid of the residents, they don't talk about any costs associated with security, if there is fencing still up.
And Brett, can you say that again? So they did recommend that we don't continue to have the residents there?
Well, I don't see anywhere where it says to have another residence there. I guess if we get rid of the office and build a new building, they don't mention any cost as far as what security would cost if there are gates and fences still up.
Yeah, I would agree with that comment, because as they go through and list the square footage of the future office building, they don't talk about some of the basic spaces that would be required in there, which would be what are we doing with the 2-car garage that we're getting rid of?
Mm-hmm.
The apartment is gone.
So, Paul, what's your opinion of that building? I agree with that the space doesn't work very well, but is that a building that could get remodeled?
In my opinion, I think, yeah. I think there's sufficient space in that building to accommodate the cemetery. It's just so poorly. I mean, it suited the cemetery at one time. I think it's worth investigating how it can be repurposed to suit the cemetery today. Just different needs. I don't know that space-wise, you walk in there and it's like it has restrooms. They're not ADA compliant, but it has a lot of space that's just open space. It's just not very well used. When we think about the square footage numbers in there, in a sense of pre-COVID days, those numbers, a 10 by 12 office, that's a generous office. And I don't know that that's necessarily going to be a standard in the future, just in terms of the way we work in the future. So, it calls into question the square footage of the building. So, yeah, I'm not criticizing the numbers in any way, just saying it may not be valid for the future. On another note, I'd say in terms of the design of a new building, I would recommend that a priority isn't only consolidating the restrooms and, space for the administrative and record retention. We're talking about, first of all, we have a client we have to accommodate, which is ADA compliance. That, if we can't, that's a big one for me. The next one would be energy conservation. I mean, the cost of the building we should see a reduction in energy use to make it viable to have the discussion about replacement or new construction. So I would add kind of those two to this idea. And the city's gone through some evaluations, and perhaps they have looked at the cemetery. I'm just not aware of those, but there are other studies out there that they're doing in terms of energy audits for their buildings, and that should be planned here as well, if it hasn't already.
Along the lines of space utilization in that building, I keep wondering about maintaining paper records for the long term. And I keep wondering if perhaps there isn't a piece of software out there that's already designed for, cemetery management, or at least records keeping, that would allow us to move to electronic records management.
We've talked about that a little bit. I think it certainly makes sense to start trying to convert a lot of that to electronic. It's safer for one thing, if we would ever
Oh yeah.
have fire or flood or something in that building, you lose a water pipe break and lose all those records, that could be bad. So
yeah.
all right. Okay, to keep going. Anything else on facilities?
Oh, sounds good.
Okay, next up is irrigation. This was a little light. I know the staff was hoping for a little more detail on the irrigation, but
So I have a question for you, Jeremy, on that and I may be thinking back wrong on this, because we discussed this quite some time back, in a few of our board meetings. But I thought that we had visited that if we updated the irrigation system so that it was automatic, it would free up FTE to be doing other work, and stuff, where this is making it sound like the system, yes, it is working right now, but would it be more efficient updating it for way down the road usage too, not just, if something blows in these pumps or whatever, and free up staff time to be able to address other issues in the cemetery. I don't know. I just thought that was contradicting to what I remember us talking about before on the irrigation system.
Brett, can you speak to that at all?
I wasn't privy to that conversation, I guess, but automation definitely would free up some time. It's quite expensive to do.
Yep.
But it definitely would free up one person. I mean, when we irrigate manually, it's all day, 5 days a week.
And it would be saving money over, time. I was surprised when that was in their recommendations.
just another question on irrigation. They do say access to water is something many people appreciate. Is that water well water or from the irrigation system, or is that city water? Does anyone know?
Well water. It's well water.
It is well water. Is that potable water if someone were to drink it?
Yeah. And it's not filtered or anything, it's just coming straight out of the aquifer.
You would want to have it tested though if you made it available to the public. At least I would suggest that.
So the hose bibs, the frost frees that are out around the grounds that the public use to get water to water the flower boxes, is that potable water or is that well water?
That's well water.
I don't know if the city has a policy on that. If the public were to come in and, you know, drink that water, if that would be an issue. We don't have
DEQ
signs
has several policies on that.
Okay.
I'm sure it's fine, but just for liability and compliance with DEQ laws, you would want to have it tested. It would be a non-transient, non-community well. There's rules with it. I'm sure it's fine. I would drink it, but I would certainly get it tested for public use.
Yeah, we would probably have to do something similar to what we do with our wells for the water system, which have regular testing and a little bit of chlorination. So I don't, you know, those hose bibs shouldn't be available to the public to fill their water bottle with or something like that.
Correct.
If we want to add, I'm not sure what they mean by access to water. Are we talking about drinking fountains or are we talking about pond?
No, that
think
spigot that's out in front of the office, it's really low to the ground. Like when I've put live flowers out in the vases, I'll fill up a water jug and take it over to fill then the vases up with water to keep the flowers fresh.
Okay. Yep.
I think what they mean by access to water is just for watering flowers.
Yeah.
And then my other question here is, again, going back to that, you know, we're providing a service, water, to a client that may have accessibility issues in operating a hose bib or a frost free. I'm just wondering if those are, you know, if we offer a service, it should be ADA compliant. Can somebody wheel up in a wheelchair to get water out of these bibs or from these locations? I don't know.
Most of the hose bibs are located right on the road edge. So I would say someone in a wheelchair could access those.
So maybe the recommendation there is to investigate that for in the future to ensure that that's, you know, meeting our expectations.
I think the board should consider carefully if that's something they want to undertake after they review and evaluate all the costs and requirements per the Department of Environmental Quality with the state.
Yeah, I agree. I would.
There's a lot of experts at the city who could assist, but there's potentially a lot to it.
It may be better spent to put up a sign that says water is not for drinking purposes.
I was just going to suggest that in the meantime. Yeah.
Yeah.
or put locks on the spigots in some fashion where they're not easily accessible. Probably is a good idea.
And if we want to have a drinking fountain or something like that, that could be tied with the new restrooms. Okay, does that cover irrigation? Keep us rolling along here.
Jeremy, my one thought around irrigation is, that system's aging, and if we have some sort of catastrophic failure in a pipe or with a pump or something like that, that's a pretty significant capital expense. How would that be handled?
So we should be looking at an asset management program around that. Like, how long would we expect those things to last before they need to be replaced? So you're saving up for that in your capital fund. I don't know that we have a handle on that. They're saying it's in good shape, despite being a manual system. So, is automating it all we need to do, or are we looking at having to change out pumps and things like that at some point?
Yeah, I think it's something that the cemetery will need to investigate and plan for.
Yeah. All right, let's go on to roads. This was a good one, right? They made a recommendation, continue maintenance practices. The roads are in really good shape. Brian and Ron worked real hard to get those roads chip sealed and tuned up, and I think things are in pretty good shape out there. The long-term cost of maintaining a lot of roads is something they pointed out, that we have a lot of roads, and that we could save some cost by eliminating some of them. But that's not something that I don't think it's a bad idea to look at it, but I don't think it's something that we would do near term. And it's, as Paul pointed out, it has potential implications on the historic designation. And so I think we have to understand that better before we make a decision on that. So I think
just to talk about this.
Jeremy, this is Pat, and how this is presented in the report, I think it's fine. They're just identifying the possibility for roads and a possibility for expanding the inventory, and the roads are in good shape. I mean, as it's presented by a planner, I don't really have an issue with how it's presented. I mean, we may not do it, but it's an interesting concept.
I think they softened this recommendation from the draft report. They listened to what we were saying and said, just look at it before you go through your next maintenance cycle. And my guess is those roads are going to be good for 10 or 15 years at this point. So we're ways out from having to make a major decision on more maintenance cost on the road. So good placeholder, I think, to look at it before we do another major maintenance, but
Yeah.
right now. So is the board okay with the way this is presented?
Yes.
I think so, yeah.
All right, above ground burial structures. The top picture is one of our newer ones, and then the bottom picture is one of the older ones. And we are having some problems with the older ones. They're pretty difficult to maintain and not very easy to renovate. And so they've recommended replacing these and moving all of the interned ashes, which is a big deal.
I have a question on there, on page 20 at the bottom there, that sentence right there. It says, city cemeteries should not develop a mausoleum now or in the future as a modest market. And a long-term liability. I just question that. I wonder what they mean by long-term liability. Does anybody recall that conversation? Why the mausoleum would be a long-term liability? I could see the capital
talking about some of the really ornate mausoleums that are the older ones, and if they start breaking apart or crumbling or that, and if somebody got hurt.
That's the way I read it too, is you're building it's a building or a facility that you sell a service once and then you maintain it forever. And especially if there's not a lot of demand for it, you're putting yourself at risk of having to take on that liability for a long time.
Well, in a sense, that's what a cemetery is. It is a long-term liability.
Yep.
There's, you know, the whole cemetery is. So I don't know that making a distinction between a headstone versus a mausoleum, I don't know if it's justified. If a family were to come forward and want to develop a mausoleum, is this to suggest that we would say no? I don't know.
Kind of just a cautionary statement, isn't it? That, and I don't know the significance of the long-term liability either, but it seems to be more of a cautionary statement. I did have a question on that second sentence of that, on that page 20, and I think it's just a missing a preposition. This is a common product that many cemeteries adopt as a way, I think it's missing to provide options for cremation customers. I don't know that we're editing, but I just thought of that.
Sorry, Pat, can you point me to that again?
Yeah, if you look at the second sentence on that page 20, right before provide options for cremation customers, I think it needs a to in front of that.
Somewhere right in there, right?
Well, yeah, a way to provide, yeah. That's it. Right.
Okay.
I was not aware that the existing cement columbarium was failing to the extent that they don't really talk about it too much here, but I talked to Ron about it afterwards, and it is a significant issue. If anything, I should think that this, dealing with that columbarium would be the top priority for the cemetery and an immediate need.
Brett, would you agree with that? I don't have a good sense for how urgent this problem is.
I would agree with that, yes. They don't talk about in their recommendations the legalities of moving remains or what cost it may incur the cemetery as far as putting up niche walls, whatever, to relocate these remains to.
Do we have space in existing niche walls that these could be moved to?
Yeah, I probably can't guarantee that some, couples can be all placed together though in the existing niche walls.
Yeah.
My thought on that, I guess, is because it talks about removing those structures, and then the other one that's there, they want to remove because it would be out of place. If we could get some more of that structure there and just place them there, because people that do have remains in that cement wall like them there. They like that area.
So replacing in the same location with that newer style of niche wall.
There might even be room on the pad of the one behind it for a couple more.
Okay.
Maybe explore putting roofs over them, steel roofs, so you don't have to move anything and just seal them somehow. It might be less expensive, less burdensome.
Well, I do wonder if we should have somebody look at these structures and, give us an opinion on how they could retrofit them. But those are the details. Those are the next steps that we need to take on. But it's really helpful to understand what the priorities, and we do need to tackle this sooner rather than later.
Just one other comment here under recommendations. As I recall, in the Veterans Mausoleum part of the cemetery is independent. The sidewalks do not extend out to the roads. Can anybody verify that or not?
There is a sidewalk that goes out to the road. I forget the name of it at the moment, but it's the road between that section and the chapel.
Okay. And then once you're in that part of the grounds, if you were in a wheelchair, is there sufficient sidewalk to walk or to maneuver around that entire columbarium?
Not around the whole structure, no. You can get up to the front of it. There's nothing on the back of it other than the back of it. There's no significance to the back of it.
Okay. Fair enough. Thank you. Just one other note, when Kim and I were early on looking at a means to create memorial-like setting in the cemetery, and Kim, I've forgotten the word of the bench that we looked at.
Oh, yeah.
But we had discussed the possibility of creating some sort of a reflective area other than a fountain or other space that would be available to the public. And Kim's looking up the name of it.
I'm seeing if I can find, I might not have it in this packet, where we had put all that stuff together beforehand with pictures of fencing and pictures of the seating and all of that bit.
Do you recall that we mentioned, we had a conversation with Sloan about that? I thought we did.
I don't have it on me, Paul, sorry.
Yeah, Paul, you even gave them the write-up with all the pictures that you had.
Yes, you did, yeah.
Okay, we are quickly running out of time here. I think we're almost through, so can we roll on?
Please.
There's no recommendation to do a crematory.
I don't even remember talking about that as an idea. I don't know where that came from.
Okay, so we're good with that.
Hey, just one other question there, Jeremy. They indicate, they say, there's an odd sentence in that that says, we're on page 20, 21. Crematory, they give a, they say something about the feasibility of it. I'm wondering, there's no indication, what I have is a comment. There's no indication of what factors, changes, or other things we should be looking for that would be indicators that we should be looking at having a crematory. So it's kind of one of those catch-22 things. Now that it's brought up, it's like, okay, do not pursue the development at this time. So what factors should we be looking for in the future when we should be looking for that?
Yeah, it's kind of like they gave us a business recommendation without a business analysis to base it on.
That's a good question, Paul. Thanks. I got that in there. Let's go to signing. This is a good one, I think. I really do think we have some good opportunities both for getting this on the historic register and doing some interpretive signing. Is that
to be clear? I'm sorry. I was going to say, in this, it wouldn't be the entire cemetery that would be seeking the National Register listing. It would be the historic part of the cemetery. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Jeremy.
okay? Does that capture what we need for historic recognition?
Yeah, I think it makes sense that we would pursue that. We're going to have to work out the specifics of how we'll accomplish that in the future. But
Okay, pet program. They agreed that this has some traction and it could do well. So this is one of the things that has to get changed in the ordinance if we want to do this. But offering an area for interring pet remains, that's the right way to say it. Pet burial program.
And I think next scheduled meeting, what are we talking about? The ordinances. Sorry, wow, it's been a long day, I guess. We're discussing ordinances, so we could include that in our next meeting.
Yeah, so Susan has been working on a markup version of the ordinance that would add all these things, so we can take a look at that next meeting.
Perfect. I think they felt our annual maintenance program was good. My only thought, and this is just a thought that I'm throwing out there, is not that I have any doubts in Brett whatsoever, but just even with a staffing transition, hopefully we can continue to maintain that level of maintenance.
I have every intention of meeting or exceeding those expectations.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I think that's another good future board topic, is to talk about our staffing there and how we want to move forward. So I don't remember the marketing piece very well. I'm going to skip to the recommendations. Okay. So, Brett and I have talked about this a little bit. We think there are some good opportunities to, market the cemetery better. And it's a lot of things we already have in place. We just need to try to increase awareness. So our website, social media, those are all real easy for us to add more information about the cemetery.
Yeah, I think I was fine with what they had listed in their summary as far as marketing goes.
And then, the idea of an arboretum, there are some absolutely beautiful trees out there, and we have great expertise in Parks Department around trees. And if we could do some things around creating an educational map or signing for the trees or something like that, so people can go out there and identify what kinds of trees they are. I imagine there are similar opportunities with bird watching, tapping some local resources for that.
Just on that idea, the idea of the arboretum, as we've seen in the past couple of years, there's been some loss of trees. Some pretty significant trees have died, or blown over, been taken down because they've been in the process of dying, and that opens the opportunity to replant some areas. Again, just in terms of landscaping, right now that area on the east side, behind the maintenance shops and whatnot, it's planted with pine trees, which aren't really conducive to a cemetery setting because of their root systems, versus other tree types that are, where the roots go down rather than out into the lawn areas. I'm surprised they didn't talk about the landscaping in general terms of, that we should, in terms of this arboretum idea, that we should, work with that certification and development of a plan for how we maintain and replace or plant new trees on the site. Or make a recommendation about what type of tree is best suited for cemetery, or what type of trees. Or maybe we don't want trees. That's the other option. I don't know.
And, you know, I would suggest too that we have that expertise in Parks Department, and, you know, they're more familiar with the local tree species probably than Sloan would be. And we can certainly get recommendations from them. I think Sloan could certainly tell us, you know, what kinds of trees cause problems. Or
yeah,
probably Brett and his staff can tell us that as well.
And a majority of the trees out there are maple trees.
Okay, so pricing recommendation is just to kind of continue to monitor other cemeteries' pricing, evaluate against expenses. I think that's something we should do on an annual basis probably, and maybe even look out at a multi-year plan for how we want to adjust rates for inflation and other things like that. I understand it's always been our philosophy to make this an affordable place for people to choose burial. So we don't necessarily want to price exactly the same way the other private cemeteries do. How are we doing for time? I see it's 2 o'clock. Can we push through?
I'm available too, yeah.
I may have to go. I do have another Zoom meeting at 2 o'clock.
Okay. So obviously we're not going to take any board action today. So what I think we should do here is I will get you my notes, and then I think we should have a follow-up meeting to make a formal decision. Okay, let me suggest this. So what I could do is give you a chance to review the notes, and then we'll get it back to the consultant, give them a chance to update the report, and then we could come back, depending on their timeline, and have that final report ready for board adoption.
Sounds good.
Sounds reasonable.
Yep.
Yep.
So if I can get this out by email, if you guys can just weigh in, make sure that I got your comments in there correctly, and then, in the next week or so, we get it off to the consultant.
Deal.
Okay. Thank you for taking the notes and that. I think this has been helpful.
So for those of you who can stay on for a couple more minutes, why don't we go ahead and push through the end here? There's just a couple more pages. This is the recommendations on services that we provide. Cremated remains.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks, Susan.
I thought this meeting was very productive. Is it possible to schedule another meeting that's not a month away?
Yeah, I think so.
Hey, I think the conference room needs to mute, please.
So I don't really know. All of these recommendations seem to make sense to me, but I'm certainly not an expert in what kinds of products and services people want. And relying on all of you and our consultant for that.
Yeah, I think the last time we spoke together as a board on this, we had essentially said we're willing to support any recommendations in regards to new services that would be, that people would like, and we'd be happy to support any of that.
My only concern here is the idea that in the future, that their comment there, study integrating this into the design of a new facility. That is to put cremated remains in a building, in our future office building. I would say I would not be in favor of that recommendation, only because, even now we're talking about replacing the office building. So it seems we shouldn't be thinking that, the whatever future office building would accommodate cremated remains just by the mere fact that, buildings come and go.
Unless you're designing it, right, Paul?
Yeah, I want to do that mausoleum that's not a liability to the cemetery.
Okay. Did I capture that, Paul?
Yeah, thank you. I'm in favor of this, in terms of the perpetual or prepaid services. I understand that there's some problems with trying to make that happen internally, but I like the idea that that's an option.
I'm trying to make sure I understand this. So I see. Okay, so when they purchase a plot or a niche, they could also prepay for other services. So it's all inclusive. Makes sense.
And I would assume that in that same token, that if there were a change in policies between the time that purchase was made and the time it was used, they would follow the policies in place at the time of the purchase rather than, I don't know.
Yeah, it's pre-sales. We would get that revenue up front, but then someday down the line, we would have to perform the service potentially at a higher cost.
Yeah.
But I understand where it's coming from. It's this idea that people want to be able to plan for and financially secure all of those funeral services at once. Did we lose Susan? That's probably something we need to look at in the ordinance. So we got pretty beat up over selling monuments and markers in the past. So we're going to not do that for now. We can offer additional engraving services, looks like.
In terms of our engraving services and whatnot that's provided, as I recall, that was when it started, it was a kind of, no criticism to Ron here, but it was rather makeshift in terms of its setup, and it was in some movable shed behind one of the warehouses. I don't know if that's developed further now, perhaps it has. But if engraving services are something we're going to continue, I think we need to integrate that in to the warehouse as a permanent component of the cemetery's overall design. You know, so that those facilities are true engraving facilities for staff. And just one other thing, which I forgot to mention earlier, as long as we're talking about staff, if you've ever been in the warehouse and walked back into the staff's restrooms and locker room, it dates to the period of that building, which is, you know, an uninsulated warehouse building that somebody tried to insulate. They're not ideal for the staff to assume that should be. I would think that our recommendation would be to, in any future work to those warehouse buildings, we include some sort of upgrades for heating and electrical systems, energy conservation, water use, you know, all that sort of stuff would be a part of that, including staff comfort in that space. For instance, I don't believe the staff break room is within the area where they're working on machines and dust and debris is.
Good comment, thanks. Okay, number 8 is the ordinance changes. We'll probably talk about some of these. They're pretty specific what has to happen. I don't see anything about the prepayment, so we'll double check on that, see if that needs to be part of the ordinance.
Yeah. Just going back to Ron's email, he wanted to look at section 12.44.170, which is monument placement. And I would have to go back into other emails to dig that up and find out what that was. Another one he said is he wanted to look at section 12.44.050, which is conveyance of assignments, which may be that the prepay type stuff that you mentioned. And the other section he mentioned he wanted to look at was 12.44.120, which is on this list. And he says internment arrangements. He had a question about that. So I'd have to go back into those ordinances and really understand them to be able to talk about them. But
Susan has that email, has Ron's additions, and I know she was also including those. So I wonder if we should get those into this list of recommendations so that they're congruent. So we talked about budget prior, you know, the idea of sustainability for the cemetery. That is something that I want to spend more time with you on.
Jeremy, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I think I was muted there for a while, Jeremy. Going back to the ordinance changes where it states to get rid of the keeping of the obituaries, that's a very useful resource for us in the office.
So, say a little more about that, Brett.
It's a useful resource for us in determining next of kin, how many siblings or children they have, to help eliminate any disputes over possible grave ownership.
I would agree with that. That came up in one of the board meetings when Mary Ellen was still around, in terms of that, having that historic record has been really beneficial to the, I recall her saying that really found that benefits the cemetery. While it's time consuming, it is a great service to have and record.
Well, and if we move to potentially electronic records, then time management could be less of an issue there too.
Okay.
And I think Paul brought up something on 1244-120. The Sloan group talked earlier about there's headstones that have like 2 niches in them for like cremations. And I think that's what that ordinance is looking to change, so we can provide an option for them to get the headstones with the niches in them. As it stands now, we can't have any human remains in a headstone.
Right, but it had something to do with the way the headstone was marked.
Well, this one is talking about the provision prohibits the placement of cremated remains in monuments. And I think what they're getting at is that will allow us to allow those type of monuments on cemetery grounds.
So we do want to allow remains to be placed in the monument?
Yes.
Yes, I would agree with that, because that relates back to kind of the image that's on page 27.
Correct.
The individual columbarium, which could be construed as a monument.
Okay.
I suppose.
That one?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I want to jump to the recommendations for section 9 here on sustainability. So they have, a couple of their recommendations were around staff levels. And I think that's something we need to spend some more time talking about. But they're recommending that we don't fill we had 2 admin positions. We have not filled one of them. We've filled 1 full-time admin for the cemetery. That's Carissa now. She's our new person there. And then we've also, through Katie and Ashley, provided additional admin support kind of centrally through Public Works. So I think the admin position is pretty well covered now, and we've got backup and the ability to flex people when we have larger events, when they need more people there, but not not having two full-time people when there's not much to do. I'm not as familiar with the seasonal position and how those would work. That's something we can look at.
As we consider, again, post-pandemic, if we were to go back to people in the office, is that current kind of shared staff position for admin, are those remote? Are those people remote? Or is that the way I don't know how that's set up, Jeremy.
Yeah, primarily the way we're looking at it is you have one person in the office, one admin person in the office full time. That doesn't include the director position. And then we would have another remote admin person that could provide backup or be at the office as necessary. So I see that person, and this is what Ashley is doing right now, is she is flexing over to the office a few days a week and then working remotely part of the time as well. So I think that it's working well and can continue.
So we would be able to maintain the office hours for people who are walking in by minimizing that or by doing that staff sharing position?
I think for the most part, yeah. Katie and Ashley, do you want to weigh in on that? My thought is that at the end of the day, we may have to adjust office hours a little bit in order to make this work, but we primarily try to have somebody available during normal business times.
Yeah, and I know that I think we're open right now 8 to 4:30. Carissa does leave at 4 o'clock. So either make a choice to close the office at 4. If there's a late funeral, obviously we'll make adjustments so that there is somebody in the office during those times. But then Brett has also stepped up and is learning things in the office as well. So if we ever needed him for just half an hour, that's always filled.
So just another question on that kind of vein. There are certain times of year, I'll say around Memorial Day, the office is a little bit busier than other times of the year. And perhaps there's even more internments going on prior to Memorial Day than other times of the year. I don't know exactly where I'm leading with that question, but do you feel like that staff could accommodate that with, what Ron's comment was, and maybe I misunderstood it, and Neil, jump in here, but there were deliveries of stones that were coming in, and staff wasn't able to run the office and do all the things that were necessary to do an intake on stones that were coming in and be able to schedule the settings. And that's where some of the conflicts that I recall were happening.
I think that's a good opportunity for us to work with the local monument companies and maybe schedule with them to bring them out and not just have them all come whenever. But there is field staff and then an admin. So I don't think that would be a struggle unless Brett thinks differently.
This past year was fine. The year before that, they brought out like 15 stones on one day. And it does state in there that we'll try our best to get them all set prior to Memorial Day. It all depends on the weather. If the ground's frozen, it's hard to dig out the foundations and get them level. So, I mean, if the weather, like this year so far, we've been able to set some foundations in expectation of the monuments that have been purchased. So that's all done. So we just have to set the stone on the foundation, which we can do in any weather.
Okay, so maybe in the sense of of staffing, it's, as long as there's a flexibility within that, then it's not, you know, it's a non-issue. Perhaps.
You know, I think we have enough history here to look at the times that we're busy and staff for those. And as well as just the time of day that we typically have people coming to the office for things. And so adjusting office hours around when we actually see people would be smart. And that might mean that we go to like a 9 to 4 office hours and leave those additional hours of the day open for other things when the office would be closed, or just more of like an on-call or by appointment setup, if the public should come during those times.
Yeah, I think staffing is always something a business should look at. I guess my concern was around like if I'm sorry, who's our new person? Carissa is sick. I know you said like Ashley oftentimes will be able to backfill, but obviously we know that especially during a pandemic, more than one person can be out and sick at a time. As long as we have some sort of plan or something set up to try and accommodate as needed, especially around sick or vacation time. I want people to feel like they can take their vacation too.
Yeah, that's something that Katie's really done a good job of cross-training and making sure we've got good backup.
Great.
Anything to add, Katie?
Yeah, well, we have kind of a rule of 3, so there's at least 3 people who can do a position. So I have been doing a little bit of stuff with even Stacia, who's at Streets too. She's been covering some phones for us when we have been short-staffed. So that it is working out well that we're covering each other.
Great.
So it's something we've had to learn to do with COVID, because we've had so many people unexpectedly out. And that, we realized that we had to have some redundancy to cover those vacancies. So,
Brett, I'm just wondering, is there a way to look back historically and pull data on, I don't know. What I'm thinking is like number of internments per day over the course of the past 5 or 10 years, and that might help us plan out busy times of the year.
Yeah, I can look into that and see what I can come up with, but typically what I'm finding is it's pretty random. You know, and that goes as far as, you know, cremations versus traditional burials as well. We've had 6 traditional burials within the last month and a half. It's fairly uncommon.
Yeah, I mean, if there's no rhyme or reason to it, then don't go to a lot of extra work, but it might be interesting to look at and see if there are
some of the
patterns there.
I've done some research, a few years back, and some years numbers are 20 to 25, internments higher than the next year, and it's just like I said, there's just kind of depends on when people pass away.
Sure.
I was muted, I think, when Paul was talking about the engraving that we do. The setup is currently the same as what he described, but I have been looking into moving that inside and looking at different types of enclosed sandblasting units to make it a lot easier and simpler and safer for the employees.
So as you look into that, let us know what you need.
Okay, I
Well, you all have done some good work. That the level of detail in these comments is really good, and I think that will really enhance this. Are you feeling pretty good about it at this point? Comments in here?
I feel good about it, definitely. Paul?
I do too. Yeah. You know, the only two, well, one, I'll narrow down to one thing. Terms of our budgeting, that 50-50 split with the city and the cemetery. I don't know the history of why that occurred. And it's never really researched or identified in here. And I'm not saying that they have to, but I think in terms, maybe it is just a question for the board. The board needs to find out what the history of that was to have a clear understanding of it. It comes up at the board meetings. It's like, well, you know, 50% is for the, and it goes into the general fund, and I'm not opposed to that. You know, it's not to suggest that the cemetery becomes self-supporting, but I think in terms of, we need to remind ourselves and city council about what's going on there and the history of that, and the reason why the cemetery's numbers may not be as lucrative or productive or as high as they could be.
Thanks for bringing that up, Paul. You're right. We question it regularly in board meetings, but it would be good to know how that works or why it was implemented, or if that's still something that should continue, or does it make sense?
It seems like a perfect opportunity to revisit that. You know, I think it's, you know, it's a little bit of a disincentive not to be able to keep the revenue in the cemetery for things that we're able to sell. So it'd be nice to see that, you know, 100% of that revenue stay in the cemetery, and we, you know, work hard to build those revenues. I think what's been explained to me is that because the cemetery is largely subsidized by the general fund, if we keep all the revenue from sales and services, then we're going to see an equal drop in the general fund revenue. So, but it's, you know, that could be a fair trade, because then we control a little bit of our own destiny in terms of how much revenue we can generate.
Yeah, I guess, like Paul said, I don't know that we're opposed to it necessarily by any means. We just don't necessarily understand what that is or how it came about.
In our niche wall sales, 100% of that goes back to the cemetery, into the niche wall fund. And I think there was a proposal in this plan somewhere that states that we should split that as well. We would lose roughly $6,000 a year going to the niche fund wall, but the money from that would go into capital reserve.
Wasn't there also a recommendation to combine those funds so that we didn't have a separate niche wall fund and a separate capital fund?
Yeah, I think they were just planning on moving any proceeds from niche wall sales into the 50% would go to the general reserve, and the other one would go to the city fund.
Do you see any problems with combining the niche wall fund and the capital fund?
The only problem I see is we lose, like I said, we lose about $6,000 a year going into the niche wall fund, and that's what funds the next niche wall purchase. And I understand if it goes into the capital reserve fund, we can use that money on other things other than just the niche wall.
Mhm. Yeah, I think if you combine them, you'd have more flexibility. The $6,000 you say you're losing, that's going back to the general fund?
Yes.
All right, well, that was a long session for those of you who stuck with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate that.
We'll get this buttoned up and sent out to you. Anything else for the good of the order?
I don't think so.
Yeah, nothing else.
Neil, do you want to adjourn the meeting then?
Oh, sorry.
I would do your job.
I was sitting here waiting for you to do that. Yes. Let's go ahead and adjourn then. And yeah, thank you everyone for participating and spending the extra time on this. And this is a great step forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
You too.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.